Every major victory in war is a result of long planning, long preparation, with the loss of often thousands of men. But when something comes along that is unexpected and you have this great prize, now there's a great elan. In the other cases, you've expected it, you've planned for it, and here you come along with something that gives a great lift to the morale of the whole force, everybody. I think from private up to our bosses in Washington and London knew that the war was over. Every one of us realized that if Hitler had the slightest sense, he would immediately surrender. But it was the gallantry of the men that did it is something that should never be forgotten. And their names really ought to be in some, I'd say, permanent place in the niche of fame that the American government should like to keep.
The people of Remagen loved their bridge. They loved it because it was an attraction for visitors from all over the countryside. And they loved to stroll across it on Sunday afternoons, to have picnics near the site of it. And they're right proud of the fact that the bridge was a strategic link between the German Ruhr on the north and the Saar-Moselle region on the south. Everybody knew that it would take a long amount of planning to cross the Rhine River, because this was the big natural barrier between the Siegfried Line and the straight shot toward Berlin. So even before we landed in Normandy, the Supreme Headquarters began to lay its strategic plans.
To explain the strategy for crossing the Rhine, a little background is necessary. Hitler still had, at that time, a very strong army and strong armed force west of the Rhine. And we counted on almost the certainty that he would not allow them to withdraw when they saw their situation to be hopeless, and take the bulk of their forces back across the Rhine, and therefore defend that very great obstacle in such a way that we would have a very terrible time to get across. So we began to plan the basic, or what you might say, the power crossing of the Rhine for a crossing just to the north of the Ruhr. This would be in the zone of the 21st Army Group under General Montgomery, and to that force I had attached the 9th Army under General Simpson to reinforce Montgomery's blow. Well, and of course we gave him a considerable time to prepare for that, you might call formal or power crossing. In the meantime, however, we went about the business of destroying the German forces west of the Rhine, and this was a series of blows that had been taken up first in the way to the north, then into Bradley's army group, and finally down into the army group of Devers, which had both a French army and an American army in his command.
There was considerable argument as to how we should cross the Rhine when we reached the west bank. The British argued, particularly Marshal Montgomery, that we should cross only in the north and make our attack north of the Ruhr toward Berlin. The maximum number of divisions you could supply on that narrow front was something like 25, but he wanted to take these divisions and let the rest of us stay on the west bank in a defensive position. The Americans argued that that was no way to do it, that we should advance on a broad front so that the Germans could not concentrate against us on a narrow front. And with a broad front, we'd have better mobility and could probe and secure the places where they were weakest. So that my plan was to cross the First Army just south of the Ruhr, and the Third Army under Patton to cross down somewhere near Koblenz, and then join them together and attack to sweep around the south and east side of the Ruhr and connect up with the 9th U.S. Division, which at that time was under Monty, on the east side of the Ruhr, and then clean up the Ruhr. As a matter of fact, we did do that later and secured something like 368,000 prisoners in the Ruhr.
At the end of February 1945, the 9th Armored Division, having been re-equipped and received replacements, was moved up behind the First Army and attached or assigned to the 3rd Corps and crossed the Ruhr River north of the dams. We then moved out onto the Rhine plain, where we encountered small pockets of resistance, which was primarily that of the anti-aircraft defense guns, which had been lowered so that they could fire as anti-tank guns. Owing to the lack of cover and the very flat terrain, this was a very serious obstacle. But we were moving forward at the rate of 5 to 10 miles an hour.
One of the reasons that the Americans made such great progress toward the Rhine was the fact that Hitler insisted that every position be held to the last man. This meant that the Americans could bypass a good many of these strong points which the Germans had set up in the Rhineland. There was great confusion in the German defenses at Remagen on March 7, 1945. Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer commander, had been sent to Remagen in 1943 to assume command. He was replaced by Captain Brodke as the top commander, who came in 1944. These two commanders tried in vain to sort out the miscellaneous set of units that kept filtering through Remagen.
As
the Americans approached Remagen in early March, I had at my disposal, in the bridgehead of Remagen, one sapper company of 125 men. The sappers were assigned to the planking of the railroad bridge in order to make it passable for motor vehicle traffic. The men had to work day and night in order to complete the bridge. Besides these men,
the Bridge Defense Company was also under my command. It consisted of 35 men, convalescents, all of whom were still under treatment. Some of these men were not even able to manipulate a gun because, of course, they had stiff limbs.
The town of Remagen had some advantages for both the attacker and the defender. From the standpoint of the attacker, there was high ground going into the town where you could direct operations from. But it was very easy to defend Remagen because of the crooked and narrow streets, and particularly the 600-foot-high cliff on the opposite side of the Rhine, which provided wonderful observation for 10 miles around, from which the defender could see anybody approaching the town.
On the morning of March 7th, we received orders and were given maps covering the area leading to Remagen. We noticed on the map the bridge of the Ludendorff Bridge. No one paid any attention to this bridge on the map because we had received no orders pertaining to the bridge or the capture of the bridge. All we were told was that we would attack the town of Remagen, take it, and then swing south, trying to connect up with Patton's Third Army.
Progress was not too fast. It was just 10 miles to the Rhine, but it took considerable time to get there. We met up with some so-called light resistance, but I've always felt that a .30 caliber bullet aimed at the right spot is just as heavy resistance as an artillery shell if the man dies from it. Realizing that the Rhine was our mission, we looked forward with some anticipation, of course, of reaching this historical river. Some of us recognized that the Rhine itself had a great deal of impact on the outcome of the war, that it had to be crossed, but how it was to be done, we were not advised. And it was hoped that when we did reach the Rhine, that we would be given a break, being an armored outfit, that we would not be able to get across the Rhine until some type of bridging had been established.
Early in March of 1945, there was a whole series of new company commanders in Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, where Carl Timmerman served as a platoon leader. The advance along the Rhineland toward Remagen resulted in a number of casualties to the officers, and on the night of March the 6th, Carl Timmerman was tapped to be the next company commander of Company A. His orders were to capture the town of Remagen and then to stop. By the morning of the 7th of March, along about 11:30, Carl Timmerman saw a great deal of excitement up ahead on the edge of the woods. He gunned his Jeep, went to the edge of the woods, and looked down on the broad Rhine River. And there he saw the electrifying sight of a bridge still standing, the Ludendorff Bridge, a bridge which the Americans never expected to find standing.
Around 10:20 a.m., the entire front line of the American infantry had reached the edge of the Remagen bridgehead. Our Bridge Defense Company opened fire with rifles and machine guns, upon which the American infantry forces retreated, and for the time being, everything remained quiet. About 11:15 a.m., a major in General Staff uniform arrived and introduced himself as Major Schurler. Major Schurler told me that he had orders to take over command at Remagen. At that moment, I breathed a sigh of relief, because I thought, now we will get the promised additional battalions. My first question was, where are the battalions? Major Schurler looked at me in surprise and asked, which battalions? Now it was my turn to look surprised. And I almost suspected that something was not quite in order.
When Timmerman first saw that the Remagen Bridge was still standing, his first reaction was, let's get some artillery down on that, because look at all those German vehicles and troops that are crossing. However, the order came back from higher headquarters, nothing except air bursts will be fired at that bridge, since it's still standing. Timmerman was then ordered by Colonel Engelmann, the task force commander, to make a reconnaissance down into Remagen, which he proceeded to do. The tanks and infantry then attacked the town. The infantry moved, hugging close to the walls of the buildings of the town, cleaned it out within 2 hours.
While the troops were moving into position for the attack on the bridge, we captured a number of soldiers, civilians, and some railroad people in uniform. The rumor came back to me that several of these reported that the bridge was to be blown up at 4 o'clock. I don't think there was any truth in that, but at the time, I informed the task force commander, Colonel Engelmann, that he should speed up his attack, since the bridge was supposed to be blown at 4 o'clock. It was then about 3:30.
Major Devers, the infantry battalion commander, asked Lieutenant Timmerman, you think you could get your company across that bridge? Timmerman said, well, we can try. Devers said, go ahead. Timmerman asked, what if the bridge blows up in my face? The battalion commander didn't answer. He just walked away. In fact, nobody ever answered the question, what if the bridge blows up in my face?
While these troops were taking their position on the west bank of the Rhine along the bridge, an explosion occurred in the causeway leading to the bridge. This threw up a great quantity of dirt and smoke, and afterwards I saw it, and it was about 30 feet in diameter and formed an obstacle to the crossing of vehicles.
A powerful detonation occurred on the left bank of the Rhine, immediately behind the bridge. I did not know how to explain this. Captain Friesenhahn, the bridge commander, had blasted the dike on the other side of the bridge, at the ramp of the bridge, a demolition which had already been envisaged. This was a sign to me that the Americans were approaching.
But so far as the main demolitions were concerned, something very peculiar happened on the morning of the 7th of March. Friesenhahn and Brodke had ordered some reserve TNT in order to arm the explosives. When the truck came up on the morning of the 7th of March, Brodke and Friesenhahn were horrified to discover that they had gotten just about half as much explosives as they had been promised, and in addition to that, it was an industrial type of explosive known as Donnerit, instead of the military explosive, which was far more powerful.
Captain Friesenhahn was calling from the tunnel entrance. Captain Brodke, combat commander! I rushed over to him. Still completely out of breath, he reports to me, the Americans, they're at the Becher timber mill. This mill was located immediately behind the Rhine. In other words, they had reached the bridge. I told him, Friesenhahn, blast the bridge, blow it up. I have no permission. Major Schöller is the only one who can give the order for demolition. At that moment, Major Schöller was on the other side of the tunnel. 350 meters away from us, only to be reached on foot. So I dashed off through the dark tunnel to Major Schurler. I reported to him, the Americans are going to cross the bridge. Major Schurler is very calm. I said, Major, if you don't give orders to blast the bridge, I will do so. Then go ahead, have the bridge blasted. I ran back to Captain Friesenhahn. Back again through the dark tunnel. Again, minutes passed before I could reach him. As soon as he could hear me, I called out to him, Friesenhahn, blow up the bridge! Friesenhahn shouts, full cover, full cover! Everybody in the tunnel lies down flat on the ground in order to escape the tremendous blast we expected.
As far as we know, we actually saw the bridge lift up off its foundation. There was dust and debris thrown all over, and after a while, you couldn't see the bridge anymore. It wasn't too long. The dust cleared, the bridge was still standing. And Timmerman said, okay, move out.
Instinctively, my hand comes to my neck. I know. If the bridge doesn't go down into the water, my life will be at stake. Something has to happen. I rush back to Major Schurler and report to him. Demolition of the bridge has failed. But I had hardly reached him when someone called again through the tunnel, Captain Bradke, combat commander up front. It grows louder and louder. Major Schurler says, have a look what is going on. Again, I run back through the tunnel, through the masses of civilians, passing men, women, children. Soldiers are amongst them. I reach Friesenhahn. Friesenhahn already shouts, Americans across the bridge. That was all we needed. Come on, Friesenhahn. A few men from the sapper unit. Counterattack. There can't be many of them. We have to throw them back. But I've already tried it. We wanted to get out immediately. But look, the tremendous gunfire aimed at the entrance of the tunnel. One grenade after another. You can't subject anybody to that. No one will get out alive. Friesenhahn, there is only one possibility. Escape through the other end of the tunnel, across the dam, a counterattack. The Americans have to retreat. I rush back to Major Schurler. Report to him. Americans are crossing the bridge. Major, you have to prepare for an immediate counterattack. I will get the people out of the tunnel. Do you want to get them out? No, Bradke. You go ahead. I enter the tunnel. Get hold of a sergeant. Summon everyone who still carries arms. Here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9 men. Sergeant Follner. Run along. Get me 9 men. Major Schurler still has 2 lieutenants with him. He should put them into action. In the meantime, I look for some more men. Sergeant Follner leaves. I shout, get them together. I have 5 men now. Follner comes back. Major Schurler isn't there. It's impossible, I think myself. And I even barked at Sergeant Follner in a rather irritated manner. Open your eyes! He is standing right there at the entrance to the tunnel. He is aggravated and replies, that isn't so. He's gone. What to do now? I accompany him to the entrance of the tunnel. Major Schurler is gone. He left the tunnel together with the 2 lieutenants in the direction of Funke. That was the last thing I could make out. Immediately, I make an announcement. I am taking over combat command at once. I run back to Friesenhahn. He will have to know what is going on. I tell him, Friesenhahn Schurler is gone. I don't know why he left. Now we have to get all the men who are still in here out of the tunnel, gather everyone near Ostberg, and launch a counterattack. There's no other alternative left. Friesenhahn agrees. Friesenhahn and I push all the men from the back to the front in order to evacuate the whole tunnel. The first soldiers leave the tunnel. Hand grenades burst right in front of them. Gunfire, machine gun fire hits the tunnel entrance. The Americans have crossed the mountain terrain. They have the tunnel exit. How that was possible, I still can't understand up to this day. How many times did I climb this mountain? What an effort it was. That was not only a good military achievement, but also a commendable physical accomplishment of our comrades on the other side.
Now, unknown to the German commander, Captain Brodke, on the afternoon of March 6th, the day before the Americans reached Remagen, this anti-aircraft unit was replaced and sent down to Koblenz. The unit that came in to take its place never did get up to the top of the hill on the 7th of March.
Since the bridge was standing, I directed the task force commander to move the infantry across the bridge. While watching their progress over the bridge, I received a radio message from the division stating that previous missions were canceled and that Combat Command B was to move south across the Aar River in the direction of Koblenz and join up with the units of the 3rd Army, which were moving north from that direction. I did not know exactly how to react to this, since we were in process of capturing a bridge over the Rhine, which I believe to be of considerable value to our forces. On the other hand, it was a direct violation of orders not to call off this attack and proceed to the south. There seemed to be one way of getting out of this dilemma, and that was for the bridge to fall. So I stood on the hill and watched the bridge until the infantry battalion had reached the far bank. My next thought was that I should get back and contact higher headquarters and tell them what the situation was, that I had disobeyed their orders, and receive confirmation for the action which I had taken.
When I received this phone call from Hodges, it was one of the best pieces of news we'd received for some time. It was a great satisfaction that we had been able to capture this bridge, and I expect I was somewhat excited about it. And as soon as I finished talking to Hodges, I called Eisenhower. He was very excited about it, and we both realized this is very fine news. It would save us the trouble and expense and casualties of making an assault crossing of the Rhine, and it really was one of the nicest things that happened to us during this period.
Well, I shouted with glee, of course, and I told Bradley, well, look, we were going to capture Cologne with and allotted 4 or 5 divisions to that, and Cologne surrendered. You've got those right handy. They're not allotted now to any other mission. Why not get them across? Well, he said, that is exactly my plan, but I just wanted to check in with you. And I said, all right, we agree. Get over there just as fast as you can. And they did. This, I forget the name, the numerical designation of the corps, but they went over very rapidly. I received the news that we had captured Remagen Bridge while I was sitting in my headquarters in Namur. At the time, General Bull from SHAEF headquarters was in my office, and I passed the news on to him, and we discussed the advantage of it. Of course, when Hodges, the 1st Army commander, phoned the message into me that we had received it, I told him to shove troops across and secure the bridgehead, taking whatever troops across were necessary, and so we could hold that bridgehead for future operations. This bridge
enabled us to get across the Rhine here without having to make an assault later on. And really made a decision to cross on a wide front easier for Eisenhower to make.
When we received the orders that we would have to cross the bridge, the thing that struck me was the length of the bridge and the Erpelay on the other side of that bridge, which had very commanding ground for the German army to defend if they had the soldiers over there to defend it. As to my men, I believe I had the best men in the army and the best fighting platoon within the army at that time. We go to heaven for each other.
From our position on the west bank of the Rhine, we could see considerable enemy activity across the river in the little town of Erpel. A very pretty little town, but it was set on the side of a mountain or a cliff. It did not lend itself very well to an attack. If we should move into that area, the enemy would have quite an advantage overlooking our position. However, since we were there to cover the crossing of the infantry, we did pick out numerous targets of opportunity, as we call them, and opened fire and fired across the river to assist the infantry in crossing the bridge.
As we started across, the only thing that was in my mind was to get off that bridge. The Germans had attempted once to blow it and had failed. And we felt sure, or I felt sure, that the next time the bridge would go. Therefore, we tried to move as fast as we possibly could. However, the leading elements were being shot at by snipers and other people on the other side, and they were moving more cautiously. Then somebody yelled, "Who has the right tower?" I looked over my shoulder. I didn't see anybody move. So I moved over to the right tower. I pushed the door in, and there were 5 Germans huddled around a machine gun. Apparently the gun had jammed, and they were trying to unjam it. I fired a couple of shots, and I yelled, "Hand hoch," which in English means hands up. That was about the only German I knew. They spun around and threw their hands up in the air. I took the machine guns and I threw it out the aperture of the tower, showing the boys that the gun had been knocked out and they had nothing to fear from it. Then, in broken German, English, and whatever other language I could muster, I tried to make them understand and asked them if there was anyone upstairs. The one kept saying 9, 9. I didn't know what it meant at the time. Now I know it means no. But I didn't take their word for it. Using the 5 as a shield, we started to move up the steps to the 2nd floor of the tower. When we got up there, I found a lieutenant and an enlisted man. The lieutenant made a dive for the corner of the tower. I fired 2 shots in front of him. He stopped. I don't know what he was diving for. I never stopped to check. All I wanted to do, as I said, was to get off that bridge. I turned around and continued the attack. Right in front of us, as you get off the bridge, there's the tunnel, the railroad tunnel. Sergeant Krebs and I advanced towards it, and then we each took a hand grenade and threw it into the tunnel. There was a curve in the tunnel, and we got down as far as the curve, and we heard a great many voices talking and yelling and everything else. We couldn't make out how many people or who they were. We didn't know whether it was German soldiers or whether they were German civilians. However, we couldn't take a chance, so we threw a couple more grenades and fired a couple more shots.
Captain Friesenhahn and I rushed to the tunnel exit, quickly grab a few sapples, and try for the second time to make an escape from the tunnel. And again the hand grenades roared down from the tunnel. And at a distance of approximately 120 meters in front of us, a machine gun fires right into the tunnel. Suddenly there are screams coming from behind us. We turn around and go back. There are casualties among the civilians. A man, a child. A bullet wound in the stomach, a gunshot in the leg. The civilians are excited. They scream. They cling to the soldiers, grab them and take away their arms. They come to me. Combat commander, order a ceasefire, stop it. Our women, our children. I too have a wife at home. What shall I do? An order is an order. This is the most difficult hour of my life. I decide to summon the officers. I cannot carry on. I tell them, according to the Führer's orders, if an officer is no longer in a position to continue combat, he will have to pass on command. And whoever takes over will continue combat. And every officer has to take orders from him, down to the lowest rank soldier. Gentlemen, I have an announcement. Which one of you is willing to carry on the battle? I see silence. No one volunteers. Gentlemen, in that case, I'm obliged to pass on the command to the unit. Then I happen to look toward the tunnel exit. Civilians have hoisted the white flag. And they're leaving the tunnel, together with the soldiers. It is impossible to go on fighting now. Gentlemen, the white flag has been hoisted, without our consent. We are still subject to the regulations of the Geneva Convention. If we continue to fight, we will give the enemy the right to demolish everything. And all these women and children, we will be morally responsible for them. I therefore order a ceasefire. Destroy your weapons, and we will be the last ones to leave the tunnel. Meanwhile, the majority of civilians has left the tunnel, together with the soldiers. We 5 officers who are still in the tunnel, we are now leaving the tunnel too. The last ones to go are Captain Friesenhahn and I. We became prisoners of war of the Americans.
During the afternoon, we spent considerable time in adjusting our guns and making notes where various targets were, so in the event that we had to fire during the night, we would have those targets zeroed in. However, when nighttime came, I was called into a meeting of the officers by our combat commander to be briefed on what our next action would be. I was told at that time that we were going to attempt a crossing of the bridge with our tanks. It was not known if the strength of the bridge was sufficient to hold a tank, but the infantry needed armored support on the other side, and we had to make an effort to get our tanks over there. So we all started across, one close behind the other. As a matter of fact, I was so close to the tank in front of me that several times before the crossing was over, I had bumped Speedy Goodson's tank. I had called ahead to him because it was so dark, asking him to make sure that he did not get too far away from me. And he says, "Lieutenant, I can't very well get far away from you with you bumping me constantly." Except for the indecision or inability to follow this tape across the bridge, we did get across without any incident.
The Americans got 5 tanks and about 120 infantrymen across the Remagen Bridge, a pretty thin force to hold a strategic point like that. But the next morning, all of the American troops within miles around converged on the bridgehead, and within 24 hours, 8,000 American soldiers had crossed the Remagen Bridge.
We established a CP just across from the bridge on the east side, just north of the bridge, about 200 yards. This CP was in what had been the burgomaster's house at Erpel. The sign was still on the gate post. There was hole through the upstairs where several shells had passed through, and we moved into the basement where we found a supply of wine and beef, which we used while we were living in that place. My only souvenir of this attack is the sign which was taken off of the gate post of the burgomaster's house. This was the first command post of the Allied forces on the east bank of the Rhine. It was from this command post in the cellar of the burgomaster's house at Erpel that we commanded the development of the initial bridgehead across the Rhine River. Beginning that morning and continuing for a number of days later, there was a constant stream of American troops from the west bank to the east bank of the river.
As soon as we could, we threw 4 divisions across on the east side of the Rhine to form a bridgehead. The Germans countered by throwing 11 German divisions against us to try to push us back or at least contain us. Fortunately for us, those were divisions that had been fighting in the Bulge and the Ardennes and were very much reduced in strength and effectiveness. One of the divisions, for example, they threw against us was the 2nd Panzer Division, which had been badly chewed up and suffered terrific casualties. Another was the 5th Airborne German Division, which had also suffered terrific casualties. So with even 11 divisions thrown against our 4, they were not able to drive us back across the river. In fact, we could expand almost at will against them, and we gave orders to the 1st Division, to the 1st Army, to have those divisions expand and advance about 1,000 yards a day so that they would not be mined in and therefore would be able to break out when the time came.
The capture of the Remagen Bridge was of the utmost significance to the future operations. As from the beginning, our plans had called for the complete isolation and capture of the Ruhr so as to deprive Germany of that great arsenal manufacture. Well, now, by getting across to the south of the Ruhr at Remagen and then waiting for the big push to the north of the Ruhr, we made it possible to surround the whole area much more rapidly and much more securely than had we attacked only at one place.
Hitler was hopping mad when the news of Remagen reached Berlin. He immediately demanded the heads of those who had been responsible for this treason. He set up a drumhead court-martial headed by a confirmed Nazi, General Hubner. The court-martial left Berlin on the 10th of March, 3 days after Remagen was captured. It included 3 officers, none of whom had any training in military justice. They allowed no defense counsel for the accused. 3 majors and 1 lieutenant were dragged before the court-martial, harangued, and sentenced within an hour. They were taken out the next morning into a small wood about 25 miles from the Rhine River, shot by a firing squad in the back of their heads, buried in 10 inches of soil. This was Hitler's quick answer to the capture of Remagen Bridge. Hitler threw in everything he had in an effort to destroy the Remagen Bridge. He fired the deadly V-2s against the bridge. He mobilized a couple of big 17-centimeter railroad guns to fire in their big charges. Most of all, he thought he could destroy the bridge through underwater swimmers. There was a special group of swimmers that had been trained in Vienna, all under 29 years of age, in perfect physical condition. They went into the water several miles above the bridge and swam underneath water, armed with charges that they were going to put against the bridge. However, they were picked up by real powerful American searchlights mounted on tanks that were sweeping the river during the night. These swimmers never did reach their objective, and they were captured by the Americans a mile or so below the bridge.
With reference to the traffic across the bridge, as you can well understand, there was only the one bridge to start with. Engineers were brought forward immediately and started the construction of ferries and then bridges across the river. Initially, almost all of the traffic was from west to east. The only time we reversed the traffic was to take back the wounded. Later, when ferries were in operation and the pontoon bridges came into use, the traffic was both ways and the bridge was closed for repairs.
For a period of about 7 days, my unit, the Combat Engineer Battalion, worked hand in hand with a bridge construction outfit that was more or less in charge of erecting the dismembered pieces of iron and steel that were the upper part of the bridge. Ours was mainly the job of the flooring of the bridge. This was a railroad bridge, by the way. And we worked feverishly around the clock, 24 hours a day in different shifts, to build a Bailey Bridge, to get treadway on the bridge so that we could give the boys some support or get some equipment to them that were fighting so hard on the other side of the river. During this time, there was constantly periods where enemy aircraft was coming in, strafing the bridge, dropping bombs trying to knock this bridge out. There was artillery fire. We stopped periodically to get under cover for these. One time, I remember, rather stupid of me, enemy aircraft came over, and as it did, I tried to find something to hide under, and it was the Bailey Bridge that we were constructing. And after the strafing was over, I realized that this is probably the worst place that I could have been, because if that bridge had been hit, I'd have been caught or trapped underneath there. But these are the things that you remember afterwards, at any rate. This was a constant turmoil. It was men racing against time, that we needed help for those fellows over there, and we were working real hard, equipment flying all over the place. In addition to our job as engineers on this bridge, the 276 also took its part in the security measures. That is, that we had places of observation at the bridgehead that we could maybe counter an attack that might be made on the bridge. At any rate, about 3:30 in the afternoon, I'd say, my unit, that is my company, was taking over the security of this bridge from another unit, also in our battalion. And at 3:30, I was up on the bridge along with, I think, a Lieutenant Enos, and we were comparing where the vantage points were for these guards. And at 3:45 or some such time, we walked toward the western bank of the river, where I had my men stationed in a truck, and we had just about decided that these were good places to have the people. And mind you, at this time, the railroad engineers are still working, and we also had a deadline of about 5 o'clock that evening that the bridge for the first time was going to be opened up to the heavy equipment traffic. And everybody was working feverishly to get this job done for that particular time. At any rate, about 3:45, Lieutenant Enos and I were down at the bridgehead, or at the western bank, and we were discussing a few little details, and he was pulling some of his men off, and I was just getting ready to send mine up, when suddenly we heard something like rifle fire. And we looked up in the air as if to look for aircraft, but instead there was dust coming up, rising from the bridge, and it seemed to totter a little, and it seemed to sway toward us. And then the center section of the bridge started to cave in. We had trucks up on the bridge that part of it was on the center section and part on the abutment side, so that this truck, I can remember, just folded up like an envelope. Pieces of equipment and pieces of the bridge were tumbling down. And I think our first reaction was to take cover that either the bridge had been hit or for some reason that it was going to fall. And then just as rapidly as you can well imagine, that whole big structure disappeared in front of us. And now we're all running to see what we can do about fishing people out of the river. That it was almost a bubbling, roaring noise, that it almost seemed like the river itself had been turned into a boiling pot with all this debris falling in it, and men screaming, and you could see fellows were hurt and grasping for something to hang on to and going down the river, where eventually they were picked up. But ours was a case of real turmoil then.
Lots of reasons contributed to the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge on the 17th of March. In the first place, the German demolition on the 7th of March had really shattered one side of the bridge and weakened it seriously. Then when the Americans put planking on the bridge to cover it over and cover over the holes which had been blown in the bridge, this added about 50 tons of weight to the bridge. There was a great deal of heavy pounding from the tanks and the vehicles that crossed. The German artillery shells tore a lot of additional holes in the bridge. Then there were the bombs that the Luftwaffe dropped on the bridge itself. One of the real reasons, I think, in addition to this, that contributed to the collapse was the amount of heavy equipment that the engineers moved onto the bridge. Cranes, electric arc welders, air compressors, all these things set up vibrations. The American artillery batteries, particularly anti-aircraft batteries, that set up vibrations that caused all the ground to shake around the bridge. I don't think that you could say that any single one of these factors caused the collapse of the bridge, but the combination of them caused the structure just to weaken and die on the 17th of March.
The action of the people actually at the scene of the capture was beyond praise. Every man in the whole command approaching that bridge knew that it was mine. They knew that all the other bridges that they had seen were blown down into the water at that moment. And actually, of course, the Ludendorff Bridge was mine. Yet without a moment's hesitation, the local commanders, the platoon, company, and battalion commanders, and indeed I think General Hogue, who had the entire combat team, hesitated not a second. They rushed the bridge, went across, and there was an attempt to blow it up while they were on it, but there was a faulty fuse or something else of the kind, and that foiled that. But the attack had been so sudden and so unexpected on the part of the Germans that the thing just was a complete success. We had losses, true, but they were minor as compared to the great prize we won.
So much has been said and written about Remagen. It was said that the bridge fell into the hands of the Americans through treason, sabotage, and cowardice. I guarantee that what I told you is true. Neither sabotage nor treason were involved. The bridge was lost to the Americans. The officers tried, and the German soldiers tried, up to the very last moment, to do their duty. Even if it was a battle of unequal weapons, and we did not have at our disposal what we needed, we did what we could. And you American soldiers who perhaps see this film would not consider it an honor to know that the bridge of Remagen fell into your hands through treason. Your comrades of the past, a Miller, a Delisio, and others, fought for the bridge, and there was bloodshed. Remember, the Americans conquered the bridge in rage.
Well, to us at the time, it was just another job. It was an objective that had to be taken, and we went ahead and took it to the best of our ability. No one, I don't believe, thought it was of great significance at the time. At least, we'll say at our level anyway. Maybe the higher-ups figured it had importance, but to us, it was just a job that had to be done, and we done it.
Captain Karl Friesenhahn, when I interviewed him right after the war, asked what awards the first Americans had received for crossing the bridge. And when I told him they had received Distinguished Service Crosses, he responded, they deserved them and then some. They saw us trying to blow up that bridge, and by all odds it should have been blown up while they were crossing it. In my mind, they were the greatest heroes in the whole war.
From Alaska to Puerto Rico, all over the world, the United States Army is on the alert to defend our country, you, the American people, against aggression. This is The Big Picture, an official television report to the nation from the United States Army. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant James Mansfield.
Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm sure you all remember General Patton's famous drive into the heart of Germany during the last war. It was an advance so strong and so rapid that the Third Army outran its terrain maps and stretched its supply lines to the limit. Today, we're going to tell you the story of that Third Army and the men who fought in it. Later on in the program, Colonel Quinn will have an interesting interview for you with Colonel Sam Goodwin of the Third Army. And now, to speak for the man who wears the blue badge, the combat infantryman, we take you to the office of Colonel William W. Quinn.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? If you recall, last week we told you about the 82nd Airborne Division and about paratroopers. This week we're going to have a change of pace and tell you about tanks, and particularly about the 3rd United States Army. We'll have a guest later on who will specifically talk to us about the tank infantry team. And now, the blue badge proudly presents the 3rd United States Army.
Army's war in Europe was over, it came home and took up its headquarters at Fort McPherson, Georgia. Many of its wartime veterans re-enlisted, staying with the new recruits, streaming in every day, learning the know-how of the newest inventions, the new military technology, training at different stations in 3rd Army's 7-state area. They learn how to operate new armored tanks, turn them in a space no wider than their own length. Signal Corps soldiers learn how to use the newest inventions and techniques, how to keep the lines of communication open, how to lay wire across a deep, swift stream in a few seconds. New weapons, new skills, improve the chances for national defense and prepare the recruits to step into positions in the country's peacetime pursuits. Airborne troops are conditioned to fit into the air age. Learn how to take a parachute jump in their stride. How to battle a wind-blown bucking parachute on the ground and overcome it. All toward the end, that in national emergency, troops using everything the new military technology affords them can form one solid, unbreachable front, keeping bright the wartime record for hard-driving, hard-hitting impact, set by the loyalty and the fighting spirit of the famous 3rd Army. Let's look at the record. In Europe, the 3rd U.S. Army bore the code name of Lucky. Their luck was that they never depended on luck to win a battle. They knew the one way to bring a bitter war to a quick end was to destroy the enemy in the field. To smash and knock out his materiel and firepower. To wipe out, rout, or capture his manpower. To liberate the enemy-held towns and restore them to their loyal citizens. 3rd Army's 6 different corps were covered in the air by 9th Air Force's 19th Tactical Air Command. Men came from every state in the Union, wearing patches of those divisions, which at various times during the 281 fighting days in Europe, served under 3rd Army's command. General George S. Patton, commanding general of 3rd Army, had his design for combat. Hit the Germans. Hit them again. Keep them off balance. Confuse them. Discourage them. Drive forward. Always forward. Soldiers were conditioned toward one objective. Get that German first. Surprise, skill, power. The triad for victory against a strong, well-trained enemy. While 3rd Army was landing secretly at Utah Beach, gathering its strength quietly, moving forward quietly, 1st Army contained Normandy, this side of the French town of Avranches. Security measures were so good that when the 3rd Army breakthrough came at Avranches, it came as a complete surprise to the Germans. In the first shock, the Germans rushed to give themselves up. They came in from all directions. Materiel and great stores of supplies were destroyed in that initial breakthrough. Its success separated Brittany from the rest of German-held France. 3rd Army headed in 3 directions, fighting in 3 directions at one time. West to Saint-Malo and the port of Brest, south to Rennes, the capital of Brittany, and east toward Paris. Captured German films show, however, that the German armies were anything but a pushover. They had trained, disciplined, seasoned troops. Frightened towns had been easy prey for the Germans. Now they fought hard to hold what had been so easy to take. But nothing stopped the onrushing Third Army. Third Army headed for the coast town of Saint-Malo, key point in the enemy defense line. They battered it with heavy guns, sent their riflemen into the town. Fought the Germans from street to street and from house to house. Dug them out of the solid stone houses, each a fortress in itself. Killed them in cellars like rats. Third Army captured the town. One enemy stronghold still held out. The German clung to his fortress on its offshore island. Third Army pounded it, turned some of the Germans' own guns against it. To prevent needless death and destruction, Third Army improvised a truce plane and flew it to the island with a plan of surrender. The Germans chose to ignore it. Third Army concentrated on a swift reduction of the fort. 19th Tactical Air Command blasted it from the air, swooped over the island, dropped its belly loads of eggs, sent this spectacular line of water spouts into the air. Heavy artillery laid down fire that quickly reduced the fortress to helpless rubble. The Germans gave up. Saint-Malo surrendered. The way was open for the drive toward the west. Third Army was on its way to the Brittany port of Brest, with its great German submarine base on the Atlantic. In all this fighting, ground troops, supported by tanks, set a pattern for combat. Typical of the French towns next liberated by Third Army was the German-held city of Rennes, capital of Brittany. American paratroopers, previously taken prisoner by the Germans, were released. French mademoiselles left no doubt about their feeling for the American liberators. Heroes fared well. Frenchmen brought out their best vintage wines for men of Third Army. A French-American entente cordiale was reestablished. The mayor made a speech. In quick succession, the French towns were freed. Third Army took the rules of the game laid down by the Germans themselves and then beat the living daylights out of them at their own game. This was the beginning of the Germans' blitzkrieg in reverse. The Loire River, with its stronghold towns, was the next objective. Third Army now most definitely knew where it was going and hadn't the least doubt about getting there. They were on their way. The swift advance posed a tremendous problem in logistics. 250,000 men had to be fed, clothed, equipped, bedded down every day. Trucks and tanks needed gasoline. Every pound had to be hauled and lugged. Men of the transportation units made their great contribution to victory in this Battle of France. In the west, Third Army stepped up the attack on Brest. Monster guns pumped shells into that port and wiped the German submarine menace from the Atlantic sea lanes. The Commander-in-Chief, General Eisenhower, viewed the progress of battle and found it good. Brest surrendered. All through the fighting, Third Army had tight support from the 19th Tactical Air Command. The 19th wove a net of protective air cover that caught any foolhardy German aircraft in the meshes, chased it scurrying back to the ground, or knocked plane and pilot completely out of the air. They kept the air lanes free for our own bombers. Expert skip bombing was developed that sent hits skimming along the ground into tunnels and caught the few precious supply trains the Germans still could operate strafed them, blew them up. Deep rivers brought out Third Army engineers. Pontons were lined up. Prefabricated Bailey Bridge sections were laid. Steel fairly walked across the water. Construction gangs and Bailey bridges weren't always at hand, but the enemy Germans were. They clung to these natural defenses and made crossings an invitation to sudden death. Third Army's war, at times like this, narrowed down to the close confines of a personal matter, bullet for bullet. Third Army men usually got their objective. But not always without damage. Teamwork in the Third Army started from the ground up. Individual disaster became company concern. With the town of Troyes in their hands, Third Army came into the area of well-remembered names of World War I. Troyes, Rhine, Verdun, Nancy. Each name carried grim memories. Here they were, all again, and once again, all under fire. Rhine, with its famous cathedral, bolstered and protected by sandbags. Once again, Rhine became one of war's major targets. Verdun. Third Army men who had fought in the First War and remembered Verdun for its mud and rain now saw it again. Third Army had another date waiting for it, the Fort Ring city of Metz. The Germans made it their showpiece. It was advertised as the impregnable, unbeatable stronghold of the master race. The town had never in modern history been taken by assault. Third Army now went out to do just that, direct penetration. They blasted the forts and battered the town in one of the bloodiest of actions. The forts were knocked out. Third Army had no cheap victories. The Germans fought stubbornly. Metz brought more street-to-street combat, more house-to-house fighting. Third Army got them all, shot them out from their cover. Surrender of Metz opened the path for the great drive into Germany itself. This was the moment. The Siegfried Line was to be breached. The German sacred Rhine River was to be crossed. Then, on 16 December, plans went into eclipse. The bottom fell out. The enemy had one ace left in his military pack. He played it. The Germans quite literally threw everything they had into this last solid massed effort. They started their drive through the Ardennes, drove a deep salient into the Allied lines, widened it, blew it out to a bulge, engulfed Bastogne. They surrounded the town, but could not take it. Our troops there were isolated. Third Army was ordered to the rescue, to break the German iron ring encircling the town, to release the Americans trapped there. Relief of Bastogne became a battle cry. The Battle of the Bulge was on. Third Army started the greatest wheeling movement ever attempted in wartime logistics. An abrupt right-angle change in direction from a course already in operation by an entire army overnight. The bulk of 300,000 troops, with fighting gear and supplies, disengaged itself from contact with the enemy in the east, took a sharp turn north, plowed a path right through its own supply lines. This forced march had an atmosphere of unreality about it. Third Army had to contend with snow, sleet, mud, fog. Bitter winter weather was all on the side of the Germans. Tanks went out of control, skidded and slid. Sleet-covered roads brought their own war casualties in tanks and trucks. The troops in Bastogne held fast, waiting for the relief of the city by Third Army. Signal Corps men fought their Battle of the Bulge, too. against ice, snow, and freezing cold, kept 3rd Army lifelines of command open. 3rd Army arrived with guns firing. Bastogne became a kind of valley forge for the 3rd Army, but a valley forge with an enemy pounding in from all sides. Everything 3rd Army had on the ground went into action. One thing more would tie it all up into a quick victory package, attack by air. But the weather held. There was lots of it, all bad. Air forces were immobilized. General Patton called the 3rd Army chaplain to him, asked that a prayer be offered, a soldier's prayer, fair weather for battle. The prayer was made. Almighty and most merciful Father, restrain these immoderate rains. Grant us fair weather for battle. Establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen. Call it a miracle. The day before Christmas came as a real gift. Perfect flying weather. Our planes took to the air, poured it on the Germans. More planes followed, and more. Isolated Bastogne was fed by airdrop. Medical supplies went in. Ground forces kept pouring it on the Germans below. Destroyed them in the snow. 2 days after Christmas, 3rd Army broke the German lines, curled back their flanks, made first contact with the men in Bastogne. The siege of Bastogne was lifted. The German bulge finally deflated. 3rd Army turned its fighting strength against the Siegfried Line in the Rhine River. The Germans had no place to go now but home. But SS troops were in the way, so they stuck around, fought, gave themselves up, or were killed. 3rd Army tore its way through the dragon teeth of the Siegfried Line, came to the Rhine River and the German town of Frankfurt. Plans called for speed, but not recklessness. Our forces advanced cautiously. The trapped Germans were more dangerous than ever. The fighting at Frankfurt was of a piece with that along the length of the Rhine. They could run away, but there was now no place to hide. The Germans had come to the payoff. 3rd Army riflemen took them as they came, cut them up, destroyed them in isolated pockets. Frankfurt went the way of all the German towns. Their world was at its end. The German towns of Darmstadt, Hanau, Wiesbaden followed Frankfurt. 3rd Army, under General Patton, never lost a battle. The great drive was nearing its last objective, the complete and total defeat of the Germans. The campaign in France, the Moselle, capture of Metz and the Saar campaign, Bastogne, forcing the Rhine, the capture of Trier, Koblenz, the Palatinate, Frankfurt. The way finally was open to the total collapse of all German-held land. Third Army overran the west of Germany. They fanned out and swept south, crossed the Danube. German armies were shot to pieces. Their disorganized leaders were captured or destroyed. Troops surrendered by whole divisions and corps. Their generals gave up their batons, their battered armies, their now discredited authority. Germany's war was over. Third Army's fighting was over, with honor and glory enough for every Third Army man. Typical of the many honors to Third Army enlisted men and officers at different times and in different places was the ceremony at Lisch, Germany, where General Patton presented the Congressional Medal of Honor to Private Harold A. Garman. A fit tribute to the fighting spirit, to the loyalty of the troops of 3rd Army who fought the 281 days on the 1,000 miles of foreign soil are the words spoken by General Patton. There are men 3rd Army will never forget.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present to you Lieutenant Colonel Samuel M. Goodwin, who I believe if we'd known where to look, we might have found him in the film we just seen of the 3rd Army. Glad to have you aboard, Sam. Sam is your nickname, I believe.
Yes, sir, and it's good to be here.
Sam, incidentally, what is your hometown?
I can't give you a direct answer to that question, Colonel, for I was born and raised in the Army. My father lived many places in the United States and at some overseas stations while I was growing.
I know what you mean. You have no home. What is your duty now, incidentally?
At the present time, I'm a planner in the office of the Assistant Chief of Staff, G3, in Washington.
Well, I was correct when I said that you were in the 3rd Army.
You were, sir?
What outfit were you in?
Throughout my combat experience in Europe, I commanded the 6th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 6th Cavalry Group that fought across France, Germany, and into Czechoslovakia with Patton's 3rd Army.
Well, in connection with the use of tanks, I'd like to ask you a basic question, and what is the prime purpose of a tank?
The tank is an armored shield surrounding a gasoline engine, today one big gun and several small machine guns. It's designed to perform the mission of mobility, firepower, and shock on the battlefield.
Well, Sam, when were tanks first employed?
The first tanks in any quantity used on a modern battlefield occurred in 1916, when at Ypres, the British used about 50 tanks. It's interesting to note that the tank was a name used by the British to conceal what project they were constructing in 1914 to 16. And the present Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, as an Undersecretary in the Admiralty, was responsible for the project. Many of the terms used in armor find their origin in naval terms, like the turret, the deck, and ports.
Well, you can, it's considered to be, or the fact is that the initial uses of the tank were successful.
Successful locally and for their purpose. However, the use of that weapon was not fully exploited, probably because the leaders who had the weapon didn't know or realize the value of what they had found.
Well, let me ask you this, Sam. Have there been any great changes in tactics or the employment of the tank since it was first used?
Fundamentally, armor of today is the heir to the traditional cavalry mission of military history. And, however, the tanks of World War II were much more closely integrated with infantrymen than those of the First World War. And even today, we find a more intimate integration, where there are available to commanders at all echelons of military organization tank and infantry teams.
Well, that brings up, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it brings up another point as to the tank infantry team. And I'd like to ask you this question. What do you consider to be the most important elements in a well-trained tank infantry team?
The first element is teamwork, an understanding of the capabilities and limitations, the tanker of the infantryman on or outside his tank, and the infantryman of the men and the weapons within the tank. Secondly is communications, the ability of one to talk to the other. And third is maneuverability, the ability to go across the ground toward the common objective.
Well, Sam, I get out of this one important factor. I believe you believe that the tank is here to stay.
I'm convinced of that.
Well, thanks a lot, Sam. Colonel Goodwin. Ladies and gentlemen, please meet with us again when we tell you and talk about the combat medical man. And be sure not to miss the interview with Colonel Canada, who's the former surgeon to General MacArthur in the Far East Command. So until next week, this is Colonel Quinn speaking for the combat infantrymen who ask you to look twice at the man who wears the blue badge. It's the mark of a man.
The Big Picture is a weekly television report to the nation on the activities of the Army at home and overseas. Produced by the Signal Corps Pictorial Center. Presented by the U.S. Army in cooperation with this station. You can be an important part of the big picture. You can proudly serve with the best equipped, the best trained, the best fighting team in the world today, the United States Army.
Born in 1911 in Michigan, Maynard Smith was the only son in a family of 6. He attended school in Cairo, spending his final 2 years at Howe Military Academy in Indiana. His peacetime career as a government accountant ended abruptly on December 7, 1941. Now 31 years old, Smith enlisted in the Air Corps. He wanted to be an aerial gunner. Following basic training, he successfully completed an intensified 9-week course in aerial gunnery on the ground and in the air. Next came B-17 crew training. Smith's specialty was the ball turret, perhaps the most vulnerable spot in the aircraft, designed for one purpose only, heavy, concentrated fire at attacking fighters. After that, a bomber base in England, from where he would soon fly his first combat mission. The target was one of the most strongly defended on the continent, the Nazi U-boat bases on the northern coast of France. Early morning, May 1st, 1943, 36 4-engine B-17s took off for a daylight strike against the Saint-Nazaire submarine pen. The battle over Saint-Nazaire is a classic example of the savagery with which the air war over Europe was fought. Within minutes after bombs away, Smith's plane was severely damaged by fire from anti-aircraft guns and enemy fighters. 2 of the 10-man crew were seriously wounded. The oxygen system was shot out, vital control cables severed. Fires raged in the radio compartment and in the waist section of the airplane. Facing an apparently hopeless situation, several crew members bailed out into the comparative safety of the sea below. But not Smith. He began to fight the fire by himself, then administered first aid to the wounded tail gunner. When enemy fighters continued to attack, he manned the waist guns and fought them off. Escaping oxygen fanned the fire to such intensity that ammunition in the radio section began to explode. Smith threw the hot ammunition belts out of the plane. Then, wrapping himself in protective cloth, he completely extinguished the fire. Only a handful of our bombers returned, few without dead or wounded. One of those returning was the severely damaged B-17 carrying Smith, its remaining engines barely functioning. For the pilot and the other survivors of that plane, it was a miraculous escape. Miraculous? No doubt. But perhaps more accurately, a remarkable demonstration of dedication and raw courage of one man. His reward? The Medal of Honor. Its citation read in part,
"This soldier's gallantry in action, undaunted bravery, and loyalty to his aircraft and fellow crew members, without regard for his own personal safety, is an inspiration to the armed forces of the United States."